Hello and welcome to the One Life Church devotional series where we cover the entire Bible in 20 months. Is the message of the church, the gospel, invading the world? Or is the message of the world invading the church? This week, we spent a delightful afternoon with some old ministry friends of ours, Pete and Jan Howard Brown. And when I drove away from the home, I could not help remember the way Pete used to love to provoke the nonsensicality of the world, and he used to, as a wordsmith, really present the gospel in compelling and combative manners. I remember the one time he preached a sermon in 2008, I think it was, "Sex sells, but tonight it's free," in which he quoted, I remember Richard Foster, "The problem with topless bars and the pornographic literature of our day is not that they emphasize sexuality too much, but they do not emphasize it enough. They totally eliminate relationship." And he's basically saying they restrain sexuality to the sexual act and they have made sex trivial. And on the back of that, I remember him preaching the gospel, the glorious gospel of Jesus, which sanctifies our lives and which brings meaning to all these issues. Now you might say, well, Grant, what has that got to do with David and Saul running around in the desert? Well, brings me to my opening statement. Who is invading who? You see, if the children of Israel are a picture of the church, and the enemies around them are a picture of those who are not in the kingdom of God, who follow a godless way, other idols, and the interaction between the invasions of Israel into the world are symbolic of the kingdom of God, the rule of God coming over the worldly influences around us, then there is a link. Now, obviously, this is historical and it did happen. And in chapter 27, we see Saul again with his crack troops, around about 3,000 of them, chasing David into the desert of Ziph. And we see David at night going down in the midst while Saul is asleep with his mighty general Abner sitting next to him. David goes in and he takes his spear and he takes his water jar, and then he taunts him and he says, "Listen, I could have killed you again, but I didn't kill you." And Saul, salutes him and goes away. But David says, "Look, what I'm going to have to do is I'm going to have to go." This is chapter 28. "I'm going to have to go into the land of the Philistines. I'm going to have to go and live there because Saul won't chase me there." And this is what he does very craftily. He pretends to be invading the low desert lands, the Negev of Judah and of Israel. But actually what he's doing, he's still fighting the enemies of Israel, but the Philistines, King Achish, doesn't know that he's actually doing it. So in other words, he's protecting Israel. He's still advancing the cause of the kingdom of God, but he's living among the Philistines. And it says he lived there for 1 year and 4 months, living in the Philistine territory, but advancing the message and the kingdom and the rule of God. And so, back to my illustration, if this is symbolic of what God's called us to do, to go and live among the world, those with worldly values and worldly understandings, my question still remains, who is invading who? Because while David is living amongst the Philistines, very easy for their values, which bombard us all the time, don't they? I mean, every time you turn on the TV, every time their values, their gods, the things that they deem important are washing over us all the time. Or are we affecting them and changing them? And I suppose as I read these chapters, my mind goes to the modus operandi of Paul and the instructions of Jesus. And Jesus said to us, we need to be the light of the world. We need to be like salt when we move amongst the enemies of the kingdom, to be able to be holding tightly to the gospel, to have Jesus ruling as our king. You see, if God is not your king, if the kingdom of Jesus is not resident in you and shaping you, you will be shaped by the world. But you see what David did as he was living in the Philistine territories, he was still following God wholeheartedly and pursuing the cause of the kingdom. I suppose that's the message for us today. What cause are you pursuing? Because if you don't, you're going to lose your bearings and you're going to get swallowed up in Philistine. You're going to be swallowed up in darkness. It's to have God as your king, Jesus as your king, and be advancing his word, his gospel, proclaiming it into darkness. And then, who's invading who? Then the kingdom of light is invading the kingdom of darkness. But if you just go and reside in Philistine territory, and you don't advance his kingdom, and you don't take him as your Lord, then what happens is you speak about these issues too little, and they speak too much, and you get watered down. Sober warning today in these two texts.